Hello all, and this is going to be somewhat of a special upload on the channel. Of course, I want to start with discussing Jean Baudrillard and Symbolic Exchange and Death, which, of course, is what you would expect on the channel, but I also, in the end, I want to share a personal story and also some of my own thinking in regards to what Baudrillard does in this particular project and how he feels about death. So I hope you guys enjoy. And so really to begin, I suppose, with at least the early part of this text, I do not expect that I'll be able to get all of this down in one video, of course. But really with this text, the symbolic exchange could be the reference really to the pre-modern, the pre-hyper-capitalistic societies, really, the more tribal societies, if you will. I know a lot of people are, consider that reductionary, but, that's how it's referred to for the most part. And so Baudrillard is going to have contention with the likes of Saussure and other linguistic theories, really. But overall he has the same methodology, you'll notice, as we'll continue to unravel his text, with reversibility and all of the different intellectuals of the modern world, if you will, such as Marxism or Freud and interpretation of the unconsciousness. Baudrillard, of course, with his reversibility, wants to ultimately turn that on its head, turn Marxism against Marxism, Freud against Freud, and even the likes of Saussure. But, what is reversibility? I've mentioned this, of course, in the last video, and it's a common methodology, I would say, in all of his works, really, until it sort of has this morphology into something like seduction. But essentially, as it's termed, it's really the turning back of things on themselves, such as his really prime example, I would say, is the idea of the counter gift, with a contrasting gift that really undermines the original gift because it's a greater surplus. It has a higher exchange than the initial gift did. It's almost a sort of novelty, if you will, and this really corresponds to different exchanges. He really points to examples such as time in a cycle or sacrifice. Sacrifice, of course, being a really big theme for Baudrillard, I would say. You have the exchange of production and destruction, and of course life and death. Every term in its value, or even in the form of anagrams, such as with Saussure. And so reversibility of death, which is really the main idea, if you will, of the text or project that he really guides towards. Death, of course, really has a, if you will, a multiplicity of different meanings and potential relations, I would say. And this is really zapped, if you will, in the modern world. Death is kind of just seen as something that's anti-potential in a sort of sense. It's non-being. It's no longer to be. But I think Baudrillard, in a lot of ways, is saying, this is simply a material disappearance, a site of being in his sort of language, if you will, of this is the site of you being, but its absence isn't necessarily just totalized with, okay, well, now you're no longer being, but, or at least the state of affair, if you will. But there's a lot of symbolism, a lot of radiance, a lot of grace and heroicism, of course, in different cultures, especially more in the symbolic exchange cultures that Baudrillard seems to have a real affinity for, if you will. Now, of course, as I've pointed out with all of really the other postmodern thinkers, and Derrida, of course, comes into mind perhaps the most, is, despite the fact that we've deconstructed, we've, removed away the grand meta-narratives of the modern world, ultimately there's a sort of a new meta among these postmodern thinkers, a sort of sleight of hand in some regards, as making a meta out of the sort of a priori, if you will, in the Kantian sense of what sets in place the foundations for a totalizing narrative. Or for Baudrillard, he cares more, or thinks we should care a lot more about the underlying ways in which a system is actually going to function. Whether or not there's just a Foucauldian sense of a site of power, if you will. How did that actually come to be is really a Baudrillardian question, I think, if you will. And I just always think that that's kind of interesting to point out as we're reading these texts, in a lot of cases almost half a century later, and perhaps what was taken or at least given the benefit of the doubt or the gift of hindsight, if you will, towards, well, are you ultimately building a new narrative with something like reversibility or seduction, where it's always there before you create a metaphysic, if you will, or a truth? Is that regarded, of course, as the realest truth of all, in that conditional way? But before I get off too far here, I want to return to what he has to talk about with a sort of genesis point. He really talks about Freud with the unconscious, and how it's somewhat suspicious of if we apply sort of reversibility to these this system of, if you will, of self-organization, really. The unconscious, it has so many of these properties that it ends up kind of describing a self-organization, I would say, where you can swallow any genesis point in a system or an aggregate, or if this were to happen within a culture, for Baudrillard at least, there's a sort of no real way of having a formalized logic when something like an event or a new paradigm, if you will, happens. That it's sort of indeterminate. Of course, within Baudrillard, we would turn to something like seduction, and how in that sort of binary comparison, trying to systemize seduction is its own undoing and its own creation. And you ultimately have these new intensities that erase away a sort of genesis point for any of these systems, because of course systems are constantly being undermined by seduction. Now, with that in mind, this really leads into one of Baudrillard's great diagnosis of what's really changed in the modern world, or modern capitalism, if you will, to one of hyper capitalism, hyper reality, or if you would like a sort of a new epoch of really the simulation. And essentially what that really means is, where theory and practice actually supersedes and defeats the material world. It's not complementary anymore. We're not, looking for a sort of Aristotelian naturalism of, trying to describe and classify geometric proofs or something with the same maturation, or that we'll be able to find it, if you will. Baudrillard says, there's none of that left. All the time, theory is actually defeating the material world. Actually, has really become its own reality. And so this sort of reality was really the second order. And so, the narratives of production, of liberation of the subconscious, of mimetic desire, these, modern world theories, and other really, significance towards a world satisfied by something like material needs. This really has a sort of underpinning of this unchanging universal human, or a sort of unconsciousness, if you will, that it can be universalized. And that's not to say that that can't be done, but Baudrillard is saying even if it was true at some point, we have moved ultimately on to one of the floating signifier that doesn't really correspond anymore to any material referent or state of affair, if you will. The references now is only to other signs. There's no correspondence really to this wall over here, if you will, to what our theories and practice and what the significance of that will really be. It no longer needs the wall, quite literally. But this begs the question really for Baudrillard, if all of our ways of trying to challenge a system kind of had a material construct of a real reality, quite literally, but also real sites of power, if this is compromised, then can this system really truly be challenged? Because of course for Baudrillard, he assumes that something oppressive exists that is worth challenging against. But just like with the indeterminate of our social apparatuses, if you will, or how they may mature, the minoritarian, or at least their becomings, is also indeterminate. And so this, of course, is really his casting of the idea of revolutionary ideas. The upheaval of the system actually feeds into the logic of that system itself, that wants to take over, if you will, the reterritorialization of those flows. And this makes it particularly suspicious, and trying to challenge it becomes, of course, much more difficult if the system actually spreads and codifies power based on that notion in and of itself. And so he spares, of course, no prescience of how much of an issue this is with really dubbing this fatalistic strategies. And Baudrillard really is maintaining that what the apparatus of capture is ultimately indeterminate. And so then we have something of these fatal strategies, or harnessing really of the chaos, which is the actual movement of the house of cards when it actually falls. But this is intrinsic to really all systems, and really he's begging the question of how are we actually going to Foucault ultimately with something like the capillary power, or the Marxist tradition, quite literally, becomes ultimately a mirror of that production, a mirror of that power. And so, again, the fatal strategies really insist that chaos is really the only actual movement, because the system ultimately has to crash in order for it to really be defeated. Baudrillard lends himself to a lot of interpretations of, just jumping on the acceleration, just getting rid of the brake pedal, if you will, altogether. I don't necessarily see this more as he wants to move along discourses much faster, move systemization, if you will, to actually be impactful as things are truly happening. Which he might have problems with me using such terms. Actually, here he's very tricky in that sense. In other words, I think a lot of these accelerationist interpretations really lends to forget that Baudrillard in a lot of ways sees that trying to accelerate a system is just speeding up the trajectories. You're not actually getting to the underlier, if you will. And Baudrillard, he has a lot of black-pilled interpretations, really, but in his reversibility, and I think subtly within his philosophy, he's trying to say that this is a bad world, and of course this is a reverse of classic, certainly Christian notions and more traditional understandings of what the world actually is. To say there's a good world, there's goodwill, and bad things happen in it that is sort of a non-God, if you will, that goes against God's grace. Baudrillard is saying no, actually it's actually almost more of a white pill to think of this as a bad world where there's these sacred moments, these sacred images, sacred significance, if you will, that have a sort of sublime in how sacred and miniature they actually are as they transpire in a bad world. Because of course Baudrillard, as we'll get into, he's really fascinated in that reversibility to something like the divine or power analysis and theory. If all of these things are always everywhere, if everything's always political, then it's actually nowhere simultaneously. And I think that's one of the more rewarding themes in Baudrillard that I think is worth keeping in mind when you approach him. So really to articulate, I think now, the third order simulation, which is moving from reality naturalistic values measured not by the real reference, but ultimately doesn't have a reference to the exterior or the material. And so he posits, does this actually mean we're in a capitalistic mode then? And certainly brings up something like production. We have to think of hyper-capital of a different magnitude now. And of course, he, in the mirror of production, he of course goes at Marx and really how he sees post-Marxism for himself. But he, of course, in his near 40 works, they kind of bleed into each other, and you can't really necessarily systemize one from the other. Even something like the title of Symbolic Exchange and Death, yet he brings up a lot of what ends up being some of his most famous ideas, funnily enough. Like, I think that simulation and simulacra, for example, is actually, at least the infancy of the idea is really articulated well in this text, as opposed to, the more pop culture famous simulation and simulacra text itself. And it's kind of funny, but and of course that kind of sheds into how Baudrillard really thinks with his own philosophy, I think, as sort of how it actually develops. But with regards to these values, these structures of law, of something like how Marx saw capitalism, perhaps. But Baudrillard insists that within the third simulation, these operational factors, such as imperialism within Marx, capitalism itself, in order to be, I would say, proceeds with something like what Baudrillard says as imperialism. In other words, there's a logic going on before you get to the capitalist logic that's allowed to actually code and form axiomatics, if you want to use Deleuze here. And so, just like it seems, of course, certainly with contemporary Marxist interpretations that you see a dime a dozen on the internet, where capitalism almost becomes this monolithic superstructure that seems to have characteristics or even functionality that is almost in that Baudrillardian skeptical sense too perfect, if you will. It's too totalizing. Everything is a problem with just capital, but what actually are the preconditions, the a priori, if you perhaps want to look at it like that, for how it's actually allowed to be. What was pervasive before, and such a philosophy that you kind of see with immanence, to bring in someone like Deleuze, and really this analysis of what's constitutive of the present. And I'm not saying that Deleuze doesn't have his own cosmological answer for something like time, but Baudrillard is trying to say really that of course you're going to miss the historical relation of those theories to begin with. A theory or meta theory cannot be done for just simply cultural analysis, and ultimately lends itself to this romantic idea of what was pre-simulated. And this is of course the case with a lot of interpretations of Baudrillard himself, but this extends really to what he says about a lot of theory in general and analysis, where there's a sort of idea of a pre-sexuality, if you will, or that there was something beforehand that was the real. But Baudrillard of course is skeptical of something like that. You're missing that it could be a simulation. And so in a sense, production has shifted really from the Marxist analysis, and now Baudrillard is trying to look at how these interpretative ways of looking at Foucault or Marx as almost being too perfect and too influential, and are just really patched almost in a routine-like fashion that Baudrillard would really call banal. And so I want to perhaps have my own thinking on this, at least for a second here, because I tend to think of the shift really from the political economy with Marxism towards really an attention economy, where monetization and attention, or being almost paying attention quite literally, is really the production now, as opposed to even functionality or usage. In fact, we're really fascinated by broken things and watching them and paying attention. Of course, if you like, there's something to be said that perhaps we've commodified how Heidegger would say problems are created when the flows of the tool of the hammer, the Heideggerian hammer, when the tool breaks, that brings it into sort of condition of a new reality almost. And what does that look like in the hyper capitalistic, hyper modern schema? I think where paying attention, there's constantly problems just sort of washing away on you on these algorithms, and you only are able to fixate on certain aspects all the time. And as Baudrillard would say, something like the disappearance, when we're formalizing and starting to write problems about something, that means it's actually about to disappear. And of course that seems to be the case with attention spans and how they just continue to dilute. We're often talked about as this sort of ADHD society, and of course it's a heavily medicated society as such. But continuing along, Baudrillard reads into something like the sites of power and economic disbursement as suspicious, or a diversion of a system meant to code its own antithesis. And really an example is perhaps in a lot of these terroristic acts, or the effacing of a site of power. We are seeing a lot of religious buildings or their significance really being attacked by someone like terrorists or just outsiders in general, really. And are they really just, well, I suppose some of them think that simply by attacking a formalized site of power are you actually destroying it. And of course this is nonsense, but in the terroristic, at least ethos, if you will, are they ultimately attacking the site of power as the objective, or to efface and diminish and change ways of life that's outside of that actual site of power? And I think that or at least Baudrillard lends us more into that understanding of it, more than just attacking a church or a synagogue or something and thinking you're actually attacking religion itself. And the same, of course, is going to be extended to the prison, the factory for Marx, where it's the focal point and really the site, the genesis point, if you will, or even end point in that reversibility. And this ultimately is to say that only focusing on this material construction or the site misses the underlying object of its production. And so he really demonstrates what this means in the idea of strike for strike's sake, where in contemporary times, and certainly in his time, there is no real objective or even a political telos, if you will, an ambition. It's simply a production, an antithesis really for production's sake. And of course that's very suspicious when counter-revolutionaries are produced for its own sake, that would really tie it into the actual underlying logic of the very system it's looking to undermine. And so the adoption of its own method to go strike for strike, Baudrillard would say that you could see this with a lot of union and demands for higher wages. What is this actually asking upon the system but a greater use of the system? We're going to turn the faucets to our way or our group's way. And this actually really resonates, I think, with a lot of the way race politics is played out, where you simply want the external goods, but you haven't focused on the internal goods or its understanding that's underlying how this is actually happening. And ultimately, of course, this is just an greater ambition for the very system or its logic to actually grow by demanding for higher wages. This isn't challenging capitalism. It's a transitory period, actually, for Baudrillard, where he says, we're going from production to reproduction. And he brings up a lot of analysis, really, of the 60s, or 68 in particular, as a misguided reproduction and thrive on production and leisure, or at least the idea, and ultimately had this sort of illusion of freedom and really was put into a simulated production in and of itself. And so this leads to one of his famous ideas that you'll see critiqued a lot or thrown at really with the left, with the divine left, where there's this endless space, this endless habitat of the political, where it's manifesting everywhere, and there's this assumption that everything is political, and the only real defiance, though, if it's allowed, is really to, or at least for Baudrillard, he says in a really abstract way that it goes back to the idea of the gift and its own collapse, and the death, or the suicide, if you give yourself to sort of death, which of course in typical Baudrillard fashion, he talks about death extremely early on in this text, but nonetheless doesn't actually explain it until far later. Like I said, this actually seems to be the case really with his works in and of itself, where you have the term in the title, but actually to really get its greater understanding, you have to go to a different text. But he's really getting at that. If you put yourself to death, to the system, and the system gives has to give back, it ultimately has to actually collapse itself. And so death for Baudrillard is at least a challenge, or at least an opportunity, a possibility of the system actually being changed, or actually having a sort of revolution, because it must be reciprocated with the system's own destruction. And with that in mind, I really want to use that as, of course, not just the introduction to symbolic exchange and death, but to now introduce, of course, the second part of this video that I wanted to get at, with Baudrillard is insisting, of course, that death historically had different understandings and different significance as a sign, before now, where it's just kind of taken as non-being. And I'd actually say to some extent there seems to be a little bit of a shift in recent times, where I think in Baudrillard's time, perhaps he saw more of this sort of scientific way of how the world was becoming, and of course to an extent that has become the dominant real way of thinking about these things. But there's also a sort of definitely an interest in the possibility of looking at things beyond just I think positivism, certainly today. Nonetheless, though, death for most of I think the majority of society is just seen as this sort of sterilization of the end of me, and Baudrillard is trying to perhaps open up the idea, or at least the possibility, that death could actually mean something different. And now, again, today, this is actually the 2-year anniversary of my grandfather passing away, who, of course, meant a great deal to me and my family. And, as I was going over this text and looking at Baudrillard again, I actually was going to record a different lecture, but I was really enamored with, thinking of my grandfather and remembering him, and having, so many great memories of his life. And I wanted to perhaps, open up that discussion really to how, death, has possibilities, and, we could actually be able to, maybe, to somehow, perhaps apply this more in a practical way of how he sees, the gift, where, I think in a lot of ways, and this is really prevalent, I think, certainly in the Latino culture, of, stepping really into your, family's code, and, only when, in a sort of cynical way, of course, when, as my grandfather was getting older, you think about something like, well, he will no longer be soon. But of course, being flawed, and just sort of the nature of what that really means is, of course, you can think abstractly about how it'll be like, but when it actually happens, it's very moving, it's very jarring, and this seems to really have a great seduction, if you will, towards how Latinos live their current life under the influence really of the dead. And of course, the Day of the Dead celebrations are going to be coming up soon. And what is that celebration? Even though a lot of people have contention with its actual roots, I think this is silly, and shows that the traditional consciousness, if you will, in that Gebser kind of way of how the Aztecs ultimately made a sort of social assemblage with the European conquest, and to split hairs about its actual origins and authenticity, I think misses the point that this is all you always have these sort of stories and celebrations that really formalize the pact of ultimately warriors that sacrificed. Baudrillard is really into sacrifice, and I think in a lot of ways, what are you doing but sacrificing your own lived life now, in sort of emulation of your great forefathers in front of you, that I think is very powerful. And I've talked about this on a really old video if people are interested in harmony and race, when this actually had just happened 2 years ago. It was maybe a week or so after when I recorded it. And basically, the whole point was, why not, follow and, ultimately deal with the imminence, of course, of change, of becoming, and how seduction, if you will, is, going to elongate and, have a sort of mystery. But, nonetheless, you need practice, you need theory, you need, the lived life of the people before you, because, they're kind of the closest route you really have to, I think, understanding. And I don't just mean that in the sort of societal, family-like structure, if you will, although I think that's a big part of it. Seeing demonstrable examples in front of you and how they live their lives is going to, of course, have a huge impact on you. But this doesn't necessarily mean, of course, that you can't be influenced like by the arts, by aesthetics, and you're sort of giving yourself to that. Baudrillard actually has a really beautiful, I think, point to make about the reassertion and what power actually is more like to him. He's of course critiquing Foucauldian sites of power and its sufficiency, but for him, of course, power doesn't correspond actually to putting one to death, but power is actually the ability of giving, of maintaining life, of symbolically exchanging gifts. And there's a sort of historicism within your people, sort of their own desire, and there's an ongoing really story that goes against the grain really of seduction, of mystery in that sense. And while of course this can't always be maintained, and there's always becomings, there's always ruptures, there's flows, if you will, that can change a sort of thought structure, if you will, or a people or a culture. Nonetheless, you still have that sort of formalized way of navigation in order to really, I think, ultimately make use of seduction, or at least in that sort of exterior sense. Another example, really, of what he means by death having different meanings, of course, is on the ecological front. And of course, when you look at past southern equator cultures, sacrifice is necessary to give life. And so, of course, within death, there's this sort of dialect that non-being is going to be instrumental to being, or to give life, and there's power within that, or at least Baudrillard thinks that that's really more power than actually sending someone to death. It's to let live. And of course, in the way environmental science is, or at least ecology, if you will, when trees and plants, they die and wither away, they're ultimately put back into that community. They sink back low. And in a lot of ways you could think of seduction and really systems of thought in general, and how the arborescent model, of course it's not well, I guess in Baudrillard's case, it might be too perfect, but when it's constructed or whatever, of course it's going to go back down and sink really back into the flows, if you will. And but what is the flows, and what is really death then? But the beginning of that next system, of that next formalization of reterritorialization, and like I said, I think Baudrillard actually lends himself to inspiration that I think is somewhat subtly seen, or at least misunderstood. It kind of goes back to his idea of a bad world with certain good aspects within it, and these sacred bits. Baudrillard is always regarded as black pill philosophy par excellence, but that's only because he's actually trying to give us the sacred and seductive white pill underneath. But yeah, this is going to really be a cap, I think, on at least the early parts of Symbolic Exchange and Death, and I wanted to pay tribute, of course, to my grandfather here as well. And I hope you guys enjoyed it, and I'll see you for the next one.